Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Um, Tonight's class is going to be the last class before Shavuos, and there's not going to be a class next week because next week is Shavuos, Thursday night. So this is, I guess, our pre-Shavuos class. We're going to talk about today is the special Haftorah that we're going to read this Shabbos. This Shabbos is the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. It's called Shabbos Mevarchim, which means the Shabbos that blesses the new month. What's unique about this one is that this Shabbos is also the day before Rosh Chodesh, when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Sunday. So when Rosh Chodesh falls on Sunday, we read a special Haftorah um, during the Torah, following the Torah reading. So the Torah reading, after following the Torah reading every week, we read something called the Haftorah. Now, the basis of the Haftorah is recorded by a rabbi named Rabbi Eliyahu ben Asher. He was known as Eliyahu Bachur, a very interesting character. He was very involved in the printing press. He lived in 1549 to 1469 to 1549, which is a pretty long time in those days. He was called Bachur. Apparently, he was a bachelor for a long time. That's where he got his name. And he lived in Italy and was very involved in printing press. At any rate, very interesting scholar. So he explains as follows: the history of the Haftarah. He says that Antiochus, who was the famous Greek king, who was the infamous Greek king in the story of Hanukkah, decreed that Jewish people may not publicly read from the Torah. So the Jewish people chose chapters from the prophets that were similar to that week's Torah reading, and that way they would at least be able to have something connected to the Torah portion. And nowadays, even though that is no longer the case, the Jewish people kept this custom, and it brought down in the Talmud and the Code of Jewish Law that we read the Haftorah, read a blessing before, read blessings after. And whenever it comes to a holiday or a special day in the calendar, we read the Haftorah of that holiday versus the Haftorah of that's connected to the Torah portion. So this Haftorah that I mentioned earlier, that's called the Haftorah that we read before the day before Rosh Chodesh, is called Machar Chodesh or Machar HaChodesh. So why is it called Machar Chodesh? It literally means tomorrow will be Rosh Chodesh, so therefore it's read on the day before Rosh Chodesh. That is how the Haftorah begins. So let's go into what that Haftorah is, and we'll see what it has to do with the way the Rosh Chodesh falling out, like it falls out this month, the month of Sivan. So the story is as follows. King Saul was the king of the Jewish people, and he, after David defeats Goliath, he makes David his son-in-law, and David starts to become very popular amongst the Jewish people, and Saul becomes very jealous. So the Jewish people would sing that Saul killed thousands and David killed tens of thousands, and this whole situation was not very working out. He becomes a general in the army, and at a certain point, the jealousy comes to fear of that David is going to take over. So one time when David was in King Saul's chambers, Saul fires an arrow at him, and David dodges the arrow and runs for his life. So he meets up with his best friend and brother-in-law, Jonathan, Yonasan. And he says to Yonasan, I can't come back. King Saul has it out for me. And he said, why do you think? And he said, because of this. He explained to him what happened. He said, I'm not sure. Jonathan says, I'm not sure if that's the case, but let's try. David says to Yonasan, let's try a experiment. And this is where the Haftorah picks up. And he says, tomorrow is the new month. Machar HaChodesh. Tomorrow is the new month. So what's going to happen when there's a new month? There's a festive meal, the Rosh Chodesh meal, and I will be absent. And when the king asks you where I am, you'll be able to tell from his response if he has hatred in his heart and he's coming after me, or this was just some sort of misunderstanding. So they carry out this experiment, and when King Saul hears that David is not there, he gets angry, and he yells at his son Jonathan, "You son of a rebellious woman, I knew that you choose the son of Yishai," referring to David, "to your shame and to the shame of your mother." And he goes on and says he's condemned to death. Right? So clearly, King Saul had it out for David, and the next day they meet up. They have this whole signal. It's a whole long story. You come to synagogue on Shabbos, you'll hear the whole story. You can read it in the Haftorah. And in the end, they says, "Go in peace." Right? They hug each other, and they realize they're probably never going to see each other again. And David flees for his life. So seemingly, the connection between the fact that Rosh Chodesh is on Sunday and to the Haftorah is really not much. It's just the fact that the Haftorah begins with those words, Machar Chodesh, right? That tomorrow is the Rosh Chodesh. So anytime in Shabbos that the next Sunday is Rosh Chodesh, we read this Haftorah. So, but obviously there has to be some sort of more of a connection than just the two words of this Haftorah. So we have to go back and kind of get a sense of what this story was about. The story of this of King Saul and what later would be King David. So it says that the Talmud says that actually the verse in Samuel, that Saul was a year into his reign, and for 2 years he reigned over the Jewish people. And what happened was he chose 3,000 men from Israel and 2,000 men from the tribe of Benjamin, and he sends the rest of the people home. So the Talmud says, what does it mean that he was a year old when he reigned, right? So Rashi explains that it means he was a year into his reign. And the Talmud says that actually there's a deeper meaning, is that he was like a child of 1 year old that had never sinned. That was the meaning of that he was 1 year old. So Rabbi Nachman, Bar Yitzchak, who was one of the rabbis in the Talmud, said maybe the interpretation is not that he was a year old, that he was a year old like he was free of sin. Maybe it means he was like a little toddler. What do toddlers do? They're always playing in the dirt. They're always filthy. So maybe that was the meaning. So Rabbi Nachman subsequently started having nightmares, and he realized that his nightmares were consequence of having insulted the great King Saul. So he actually said, I asked forgiveness from the bones of Saul, and he still didn't get forgiveness. So he had to say, I asked forgiveness of the bones of Saul, the son of Kish, king of Israel, and eventually the nightmare stopped. So we see from here that obviously King Saul is considered to be a great person, even though, as we'll see, his dynasty did not continue. Right, King David becomes the king, and the Davidic line is the king. The kings will always be the kings of Israel from then on. So the Talmud asks this question: why did they, if King Saul was so great that even insulting him, so to speak, in after his passing, that it affected this rabbi? So the Talmud answers that because there was nothing that had happened, there was nothing in his background, in his lineage, that there was no flaws. He had perfect lineage. Versus King David, who was descended from Ruth, right, which we're going to read about on. Some communities have a custom to read about that on Shavuos. Who was a Moabite and a convert to Judaism. Because he had a flaw in his lineage, that's why his dynasty kept going. Why is that so important to have a flaw in your lineage? So when it sounds counterintuitive, because if he were to become haughty, somebody could always say, "Look where you come from," right? Look behind you and look where you come from. So that way, there would always be that humility to his background. So now let's flip the question on the other hand. how can we say that how can we say that having a convert in his past, how can we say that was a detriment? Number one, because you know Ruth was a great woman, obviously, even though she was a convert. And number two, we know there's a specific a verse in the Torah and a commandment in the Torah that tells us we're not allowed to harass. I think that's the word. A convert to say and say, look how where you came from, right? Look at your past, and it used to be not Jewish, so like don't get on your high horse, right? You're not allowed to do that to a convert. Um, a specific prohibition in the Torah to not harass the convert, and that applies as well to somebody who is a Baal Teshuvah, someone who repents. The same thing applies, that we're not allowed to say, "What do you think you're so special? Look what you used to do. You used to be a sinner," right? So we see this idea. We see this idea in Jewish law when it comes to not really Jewish law, but when it comes to the approach of how a person should approach negative things. So even though that we say a convert is somebody who it's like they're reborn, and somebody who is about tshuva is similarly, someone who repents is similarly, like his not only that his slate is wiped clean, but his um, his uh, sins be transformed into merits. So, but at the same time, in the end of the day, that person has a different experience than somebody who is always righteous. And the Talmud brings this example about when it comes to not kosher food or not kosher clothing, wearing shatn, as a Jew is not allowed to wear wool and linen together. So when it comes to that, the Talmud tells us that what a person should say, I'm not that I'm disgusted by these non-kosher items, but rather I would enjoy them. I'm sure I would enjoy non-kosher food, but the Torah tells me not to do it, and that's why I do it. Just because God told me, not because they're disgusting in and of themselves. So, however, the Maggid of Mizrich, who was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov, he said that that only applies when it comes to a righteous person. Somebody who has an experience with those things, meaning he's a Baal Teshuvah, he's somebody who repented from a negative past. He should not say, "Oh, well, those things are really wonderful, but just God told me not to do it." Right? Because he has the tendency, so to speak, he has the experience in those things. He should just say, "It's not for me. Those things are bad, and I'm not gonna even say, well, they really are wonderful, but just God told me not to do it," because he has that experience. So, in other words, that King David had that, so to speak, flawed lineage because even though that it wasn't necessarily like a bad thing, and we're not allowed to remind them, but at the end of the day, that means he has a, so to speak, a tendency towards certain things. They're in his what do they call it now? Generational trauma, right? He had genes that lended him towards negative things because that was his lineage. So when it comes to so what we see here is that when it comes to somebody who has to be a Jewish leader, it's not enough that they should be somebody who is perfect. In fact, perfection, as we see, is not good, because a Jewish leader has to be somebody who is actually relatable and can relate to the masses. And if he is so beyond that he can't even say, "Look at my past, there's something not perfect about me," right? Then he's not relatable to regular people. So therefore, actually, King David's lineage and that, so to speak, flaw in his lineage is actually something that becomes a positive. So based on this, now that we kind of get a sense of the difference between King David and King Saul, we can kind of see what this idea of this Haftorah, of this story about King David having to flee, we could see how is this relevant to the fact that Rosh Chodesh is going to be the next day. We know that Rosh Chodesh, the new month, is based on the lunar cycle, and the new month represents the birth of the new moon, right? But what happens the day before the birth of the new moon? The day before the birth of the new moon, which in this case will be Shabbat, the day that we're reading the Haftorah, the moon is actually totally covered, right? And you can't see it at all. It's total darkness. Then on Rosh Chodesh, it starts again, the cycle, right? And the Jewish people are compared to the moon. And we know that eventually, even when a situation when the moon is totally black and totally dark, there'll be a renewal, right? Every month there's a renewal. So when it comes to Yonasan, right, Jonathan and David, this idea is is really represents this, right? Jonathan is the son; he's the heir to Saul, right, representing that righteous path, that perfection. Versus David represents his lineage, his flawed lineage represents this concealment, right? That he is like kind of like that moon where there's nothing to be seen the night before the birth of the new moon, which is the new month. So when he's saying that tomorrow will be, when King David says it says that tomorrow will be the new moon, meaning that he understood because he was relatable to the regular person. He's saying that today it may look black. It may look like we're in the ultimate darkness and there's nowhere to go from here, right? Things have been going down, the moon's getting smaller and smaller, and it gets totally black, but tomorrow there's a rebirth, right? Because King David could relate to that versus Jonathan. So um, so we see here that, and that's really what David was saying about himself, right? His situation in that time was totally dark, right? That he had fallen from being the king's son-in-law and the king's general, and now the king wants to kill him, right? But he's telling Jonathan, don't worry, there's going to be a rebirth. There's going to be a new moon. There's going to be another opportunity. And of course, he was right, right? Eventually, King David becomes the ultimate Jewish king that becomes the Davidic dynasty that exists until the coming of Mashiach. Mashiach will be a descendant of King David. So what we see here is that, and that's why this Haftorah is read specifically before whenever Shabbos falls out, the day before Rosh Chodesh, and Rosh Chodesh is going to be on Sunday. That we're saying that this is exactly the message of the day before Rosh Chodesh. That it looks dark. It looks like there is no hope. It looks like there's nothing good that could come out of this kind of thing. And maybe you think that you can't be a Jewish leader because there's this darkness, right? You can't be an influence on others. You think that there's no hope. We know that tomorrow is going to be a new day. So that is the message of this Haftorah, that whenever we come a situation in life, looks like there's nothing to come to, it looks like there's no hope, it looks like it's all darker and it's been trending this way, going darker and darker and darker. You know, as the Jewish people, there's always a rebirth and there's always another chance. So thank you everybody for joining us. I want to wish everybody a good Shabbos, a wonderful week, and a happy Shavuos, a good Yontif, and Kabbalah Torah B'Simcha Pnimius. We should accept the Torah on Shavuos with joy and in an internal way.